because I've got this first one done already.
Okay, go ahead.
So I'm gonna do it. And
All right, for
I'm
some
gonna do it to
reason-
my computer and then I'll forward them both to him.
All right,
Okay.
I don't know why it's saying your screen sharing is paused. Is there? Okay, there we,
Just click resume share.
right. Yeah, the only other thing says stop share, right? Can you see the screen?
Yes,
Okay.
you're sharing.
All right, if anyone has a copy of the first lecture, recorded it, that's fine and dandy. I'm gonna.
Michael, question.
Sure,
What we're seeing is your directory. We're not seeing any slides.
okay.
I thought that's what you wanted us to see. Otherwise-
No, I want you to see,
Well, then go to World War I on your directory.
I'm here in the, I'm seeing, it says introduction to the goals of the lecture.
Okay, stop the, okay, you selected the wrong thing. Stop the share, stop it.
Right?
I'm gonna
You're
hit
up.
resume.
You're sharing your screen. We don't share our screens.
I understand.
Okay.
Can you all see this?
Yes,
Okay.
All right. Close your eyes. I have to go to the slide number 60. And I don't want anyone to get too upset with this.
You can just jump to it.
Well, again, that presumes that I know what I'm doing.
I thought you did. Okay, never mind.
Okay, we're almost there. My apologies for this. Okay, here we go. As we talked about in the last lecture, we built up the idea that the transition from 1916 to 1917 ended up being a seminal point in World War I. What happens from 1917 on, I'm going to address from a couple of different perspectives, with less emphasis perhaps on some of the military aspects than on some of the ideological and governmental changes that took place. These are fairly complex, but the reason I'm bringing them forward is that from my perspective, and I understand people will differ about this, but from my perspective, what happens in 1917 and 18 in particular influences the rest of the 20th century and into our 21st century, literally right up to today. And some of these issues, I believe, are of critical importance. And in reviewing this information together, what we're going to see is a major transformation in what I would call international politics and goals and objectives. Something like this had really not existed in its complete form prior to this date. And we'll talk more about it as we move along. The first issue, as I call interlude, is really just more a matter of looking at this transition more carefully and in detail than you will get when you're reading through most histories of World War I. So I want to start with this very first one of nationalism versus ideology. Prior to this time, the vast majority of international politics was based around what I call realpolitik. It had to do with the power of a particular nation as expressed primarily through its acquisition and control of territory. Now, the basis for wanting that territorial concern often lay in economics, but was not solely related to that. But that was a big element to it. In addition, it's very important to remember that prior to the late 1700s and 1800s, nearly every nation in the world was governed by a monarchy or an aristocracy of some sort, with the monarch having more or less power depending upon the peculiarities of that nation. Now, there were a few exceptions, but they were truly few and far between. And until you got into the middle of the 1800s and began to approach towards the 1900s, the power, the economic power, the military power, the social power, the cultural power lay primarily with those countries which were ruled by monarchs. Now that began to change, and part of the reason for that change goes back not so much to the American Revolution, much as we might like to look at the principles that were laid out in the American Revolution, but more particularly, especially as it affected Europe, in the French Revolution and French philosophy. Now, once those took hold and spread widely through the Napoleonic Empire in particular, but had a global reach because of the interrelationships of language and things of this nature, the foundations for what became a major transformation in international politics began to grow and assert itself. And this became particularly powerful during the late 1800s and now into the 1900s. The concept of nationalism has persisted and will persist pretty much through all of history whenever you have a nation state and a political boundary. And those particular interests that the nation has will of course be front and center. But as we see even today, even in the most recent news articles related to international politics, we see a shifting emphasis onto a different aspect. And that aspect I put under the global term of ideology. What do I mean by that? There's a certain concept of truth that lies at the heart of the word of ideology. This concept of truth can be more or less mutable within a particular institution, but generally has very concrete fixed points. Once ideology takes over, as I will try to demonstrate through the rest of this lecture today, is that this particular concept, this particular concrete foundation really brooks very little compromise. And many actions can be taken because of the importance ideology has to the particular unit which is in power at the time. That may be a political party, or it may be a government, or it may be another organization within a nation, or it may be a nation itself. And we're going to talk about that a little more concretely. The importance, therefore, is that there's a conflict which arises in the various nations engaged in this conflict over the differences between realpolitik, which had driven European international relations for centuries, now shifting. It was partly manifest in the revolutions of 1848 that we talked about last spring, when we talked about how there was this uprising of various revolts throughout all of Europe, rather spontaneously, not coordinated, and suppressed mightily by the central governments pretty much everywhere it happened. But as we get into the late 1800s and now into the 1900s, these particular uprisings focused on ideological issues, not just economic issues, become front and center. We'll talk about that significantly in another part. Now, what I showed in Wilson's 14 points is an issue that underscored how the entry of the United States into the complex international politics before we joined the war, but in terms of setting forth principles on which the conflicting powers could negotiate, is now no longer related directly to territory as such. It's not the acquisition of territory, and I'll go back one slide just to show this. What we have down here, for example, is that there is to be autonomy, for example, of Austria-Hungary's people. What this meant was that the nations were to be broken up according to their ethnic composition. Without being too dramatic, it is very clear, Wilson in terms of his own particular personal philosophy, and I'm putting progressivism aside, we'll come back to that in a little bit, was what we would call today racist. Now, without using it in quite the same pejorative nature that it carries with it today, what it really meant is that Wilson saw the races as distinctly different. And indeed, the actions he took when he was president to ensure this sort of, I'll call it separate but equal stance within this particular country between blacks and whites, is something that was not reflected so much in a sense of natural moral superiority, though it may have had a part of that in it, but rather that there were distinct differences among different ethnicities. The emphasis that we see in these 14 points in good measure is related to that perception that ethnically homogeneous communities tend to function better with less internal dissent than if you had non-homogeneous nations. And this was particularly true because of the way the war broke out between Austria-Hungary and Serbia, and then Russia coming in because they saw an ethnic connection to the Slavic people whom they believed were of similar kin, and of the desire in part on the part of Serbia to separate Serbians who were living in Austria-Hungary and become part of the greater Serbia. So this ethnic issue was not something that we can ignore. And Wilson in many ways embodied this. In addition, when we come down a bit further, when he actually declares war in April of 1917, he talks about making the world safe for democracy. Now, up to this point, the vast majority of countries were run by monarchies with little to modest representation from the general people. But the concept of putting forth democracy lay a foundation for the rest of the world to focus on and say, this principle of being a democratic government allows us as a suppressed people, for example, in the form of all the different colonies that existed around the world in the French Empire and the British Empire and the Russian Empire and so on and so on and so on. All of these suppressed people could see that they lack a voice. And in doing so, in effect, by saying we want to make the world safe for democracy, not only is America exporting its own particular ideology, which it believes is in the best interest of the rest of the world, but it also is setting a path, a guide for many other nations whose people feel suppressed to revolt against those people. So that becomes a very distinct and important element. And as you will see play out through World War II and afterwards, in particular, the overthrow of colonial rule is largely based upon this kind of principle. Not that they necessarily embrace democracy, but they did embrace the idea that they couldn't be suppressed by others who were not of their own creation, that is, of their own election or selection. The Bolsheviks, having based a lot of their principles on the concepts of socialism, but in particular referencing Karl Marx and his work, looked at the situation a bit differently. For them, the issue was not a matter of democracy, but it was still a matter of oppression. And the oppression was based upon the elite and capitalism, both the elites in government, capitalism in terms of the economy, suppressing the workers. Because you worked, you were literally the person who actually produced. And therefore, anyone who wasn't engaged directly in producing, but had his wages determined by his boss, or his goals determined by the company or whatever was oppressed as well as suppressed from joining into the political matrix. On the surface, that was an idea which became permeating through much of Europe and began to spread much more widely. In this particular situation, therefore, and in Russia in particular, this particular principle took hold. And there were a number of parties which were developed around the socialist, and we'll use the small c, communist ideology, becoming part of government. When that happens, when you become a part of government, you now are legitimized. As opposed to what happened, for example, in 1904 and 1905, when there was a temporary, call it, Russian Revolution after the Russians lost the Japanese-Russian War in 1904-05, and those parties are suppressed, yet within a particular period of time, they were resurrected and incorporated into government. Now, their particular ideology, and expressed most concretely on the part of the Bolsheviks, was not that the focus was only on Russia, but became global. So in the sense that Wilson talked about make the world safe for democracy, the world, so too the Bolsheviks were looking at a global initiative. And indeed, they were very clear about trying to stimulate this kind of revolution in every country. In fact, it's sometimes alleged by historians that Marx would have thought Germany would have been the primary focus for the proletariat revolution to occur, rather than Russia. That it happened in Russia is in part due to the legitimization of the various socialist and communist organizations that became part of government. We'll talk a little more about that. Now, the other part of this is that the competing powers were not blind to this situation. They were very aware of it. And indeed, a lot of the difficulties that arose in international politics was based upon the appreciation of what these particular ideologies, Wilson's democracy, the Bolsheviks' revolution of the proletariat, could imply to their own nations, and how this would overturn their structures, their economies, their governments, indeed their cultures. When I talked a couple of years ago about the Civil War, one of the things I tried to emphasize to people was not that you have to accept this particular dynamic, but you should at least understand it. And it was this: the Southerners at the time, embracing slavery as their normal social and economic organization, saw the North as threatening that, as a viable institution. But it meant more than economy, it meant more than social nature. It was their whole culture. It was everything on which there was some basis for how Southerners acted. Whether they held slaves or not was almost unimportant. There was a different dynamic in play. When someone wants to come in, and we can put it in this specific way for each of us to consider, although it'll sound strange, is suppose the Taliban came in and said, right now, all the rules under which you've lived are gone, and you're going to live the way we tell you. Well, when you take that approach, you're going to say, now, wait a minute, I'm not sure I buy that, okay? Well, they say that's what you got to do, or we're going to get rid of you. Because ultimately, and this was especially true with the Bolsheviks, and you see this play out in the 1920s and 30s in particular, is that it truly was, if you're not with us, you're against us. And we determine if you're with us. And whatever measures we bring to that equation are what we apply to you. And if you're not with us, then we can do anything we want to you. Most of us think about that as Nazi Germany, less with fascism in Italy. But as reading will show you, in the 20s and 30s, this was absolutely the case in Russia and how things played out there. Now, to show you its relevance to our particular time, I put this slide up. Pretty much all of us have heard the song Imagine by John Lennon. And I have to admit, the first time I heard it, I thought, well, you know, it's kind of a nice song. It's sort of utopia and nature and, you know, whatever. But what struck me was its popularity, its ongoing popularity. And as I read more about what was happening with the Bolsheviks and communism, particularly in the Soviet Union after the war, I couldn't help but go back and put a comparison up between John Lennon and Karl Marx. Now, I'm obviously not going to read it to you, and it's been up there for a while, so probably you've read it yourself. But look at the comparison. This is a form of ideology expressed seemingly with just platitudes on the part of John Lennon, but at its particular heart, you look at the implications here, and the implications are substantial. So this is the kind of thing that, at least in articles that I read and other things you all may have heard, is that our particular youngest generation or younger generations have a very favorable view towards this kind of utopia approach. But what it also means is that you've got to take this other side of it. When we look at what's happening in our own country now with the demonization of our past, look at the very top here. The past dominates the present. In communist society, the present dominates the past. What that means is you obliterate the past. It has no particular relevance, okay? We'll see a deeper expression of this towards the end of these lectures when we come to Lenin's 21 Theses, which will express in his own words, in his own directives, how he thought this would go forward. But it is vital for all of us at this particular time frame of the beginning of 1917 to understand that these philosophies were known by the contesting nations. And they took it into account when they considered what was going to happen through 1917. Now, what else was happening? Enormous technological changes. The current approach that most of us have in thinking about World War I is the Western Front, static warfare, trench warfare, going over the top, getting machine gunned to pieces, stupidity on the part of generals, the inability to innovate. I already addressed a little bit of that in the last lecture when I talked about how the generals had prepared for maneuver warfare, which was indeed the way the war began. But now they were confronting something very different. And in addition to what they were confronting that was very different, and I'll go into detail on that later, they had enormous technological changes that developed within a very short period of time. And these technological changes had to be incorporated into the conduct of the war, which meant understanding the technology, its limitations, its benefits, how to train people to use it properly, how to institute the right doctrines down to the lowest level, and then create a comprehensive plan that would govern the offensive actions or the defensive actions with all of this kept in mind. The most important, the application of doctrine and specialized training. Everything else was really a vehicle. Air combat was brand new, literally added a new dimension. And it was very clear from the very beginning when the primary purpose of aircraft in 1914 was for reconnaissance, that all of these other missions had to be brought into the mix. And Technological changes had to be made in order for these missions to be accomplished. This took an enormous amount of effort, a great deal of research, which was ongoing at the time, as well as training and, again, indoctrination to the proper way to use them. And this was something, since no one had really dealt with it before, took a great deal of learning. But it was remarkable in terms of reading about these histories through this period of time, just how creative these officers were in getting these kinds of doctrines established and disseminated. Now, naval combat showed a little bit less innovation over the period of time, though there certainly were substantial developments that took place. The primary issues that they were looking at in naval combat related to the concept of the blockade, either with submarines, when your surface ships could no longer perform the blockade, or the combination of surface ships plus mine barriers. When you put mines down in block areas, you retard the ability of merchant ships to transgress those areas without getting blown up. We've seen even in the Gulf a number of years back where a few mines floating around in the Gulf blew up some tankers and even, I think, damaged a couple of American warships. So this is something that reached enormous capability during this particular war. Blockades had been used for centuries. Intercepting merchant shipping had been used for centuries. You just go back to the War of 1812, for example, and how the United States responded to the overwhelming power of the British Navy. We had a few ships out there raiding their merchant fleets. And when we could get in among the merchants, we could sink them. And we did an enormous amount of damage that way. During the American Civil War, a few Confederate ships that got out into the major sea lanes did an enormous amount of damage to merchant shipping. So this was all known. Convoys were known. There was nothing really new. It was a matter of rediscovery. But the important part was that all of this showed a little bit less transition than it did on the land side of it. Now, the other major transformation, which came more to fruition in 1917 and 1918, but certainly had been created increasingly through 14 and 16, was this development of total war. In this particular situation, unlike previous conflicts, the entire nation was really to be mobilized coherently. In the past, it was a little more sporadic and episodic, according to the needs of the time. And in general, conflicts did not last as long as this did, with essentially continuous warfare. In the past, many times there were engagements and then a hiatus. And in the hiatus, certain things would happen: resupplies, maneuver, replacement, training, things of that nature. But unlike those situations, in this particular conflict, war was continuous. Even if there were no major battles going on, that is, the major offenses that we've identified through the previous lectures and we'll talk about in the coming lectures. But every day, there is fighting. Every day, there are casualties. And the only way you can sustain that effort is if you mobilize the entire nation. Now, that also sets up the counterpoise of how do you deal with your opponent who has mobilized his entire nation? That means that entire nation is a target because they're supporting the war effort. And that transforms the kinds of decisions you feel you're allowed to make, indeed required to make, in order to conduct the war to a successful conclusion. because you're not going to expend all this energy, treasure, lives, disruption for nothing. Just as a very quick reference back to the peace initiatives that were being sought in 1916 into early 1917, the one thing that the Pope and Wilson ignored was that you couldn't go back to the status quo ante and expect that the nations were going to buy that after what it had cost them to get this far. They just couldn't see it, couldn't accept it, nor could their people really accept it. So at this particular time of the war, the transitions not only were technological, not only ideological, but now your target was bigger. It wasn't just the soldiers on the front line. It was now the entire nation. And while the ability to directly attack the entire nation, as was done when Germany launched Zeppelins, for example, against England, or used their particular cannon once in 1918 when they lobbed shells 70 miles into Paris, those kinds of things weren't really so much designed to destroy the host nation. They were designed to undermine morale, because once morale collapsed, as we'll see happens in Russia in 1917, then that nation's going to leave the war. So that again is part of the change that is absolutely dramatic. Now, if you think about it, how did we conduct, or how was World War II conducted? Entire nations were targeted. It didn't matter who was living in that particular city. You might say, well, I'd like to hit this factory rather than, blast the residential area around it. But technology hadn't reached the point where you could do that. So you obliterated the city. And that was the kind of total war concept that permeated this part of World War I and carried us all the way through much of the 20th century. So keep this in mind as part of it. Now, you'll notice I wrote down cyber warfare. The reason for this is that it's a term we're familiar with now, but it correlates as well with what nations did in order to mobilize themselves sufficiently to conduct total war. It wasn't just a matter of central organization over the economy, though I'll address that in a little bit. It also had to do with convincing your population. Now, the role of propaganda. We normally think that that's directed towards your opponent. Tokyo Rose wanting to tell American soldiers, listen, just go home. Your wives are back there with the guys in the rear making, whoopee, and you're stuck out here getting shot at. What's the point? Much more of it truly was propaganda within your own nation, within your own country. You needed to create a very clear difference between yourself and your opponent. If you didn't do that, if you maintained too much sympathy towards your opponent, then you wouldn't be willing to do the things that are required to win the war. And winning the war meant bending your opponent to your will. In every conflict that's occurred, the choice is either completely annihilate your opponent, which actually occurred extraordinarily rarely, or bend him to your will. You needed to have a clear distinction between what you represent in yourself, in your nation, and what this other is. And it has to be other. It has to be seen as perverse. And we know that that's true as we look through many, many different elements of warfare over time. But you also have to counter the decline in morale within your own country. If you can't do that, then ultimately you're going to lose support for the war. All of the sacrifices that are required, including losing family members. Just think of the Vietnam War. Think of the Gulf War, the ongoing war in Afghanistan. In spite of what we could look at in terms of numbers and say, this really is a pittance compared to these conflicts, the morale of the nation is turned against these actions. It's said, it's too much. We don't want to go there anymore. And that's because, in effect, in a somewhat extraordinarily expressed way, the propaganda supporting it has faded away. So the thrust then moves towards the politicians of trying to figure out how to keep their people in the fight, because the ability to negotiate a peace has now diminished because the sacrifices have become so great. This becomes a real issue, and we'll talk about it in detail when we get to Russia. These are just some very quick examples. I just throw them up here so you can kind of see them and get an idea. But one of the things you'll look at is restrictions on the press. If you don't restrict what the press can write, then you can't control the narrative. Does this sound familiar, even when I use the word today in the 21st century? More and more, we're beginning to see criticisms of Facebook and other social sites, Twitter, I guess, and others, for trying to control the narrative. Well, the idea behind it is you have to generate this kind of approach, because if you provide too much information, then you're going to confuse everybody and nobody will know what to believe. And if they don't know what to believe, then they won't know how to act. So controlling the narrative is very important. Now, we see this expressed most deeply when we see what happened in Germany after the war, in Russia after the war, and so on and so forth. But within every nation, to a large degree, restrictions on the press were severe. And narratives that went outside what the government approved could get you in serious trouble. Remember that during the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln shut down papers and imprisoned editors for publishing things that he felt were contrary to the directions that the Union was to take. He said that the Constitution was not a suicide pact. Different kinds of approaches. Again, demonize your opponent, as you'll see in the upper left, or show that you, as a member of the British Empire or of the German Empire, you have a role to play. This is important. It's patriotic. It's what you have to do to save your culture and everything else that is of value to you. And every country did this. Every single one. All right? Because it was fundamental to how you kept people in the fight. You had to appeal to which nature would be most likely to gain you support. And there was great effort put into this, a real psychology analysis, if you will, psychological analysis to figure this out. It was certainly not something that was haphazard, though over time, especially now as we see today with the internet and what we consider to be odd pieces of information that show up by other governments sort of subverting different activities and interjecting false information to disrupt how people engage with each other. So propaganda, which often got a bad word because of its perverse nature of showing only one side or really drawing a distinction between the two sides, is something that's literally with us every day in every administration. It doesn't matter what party you belong to or if you don't belong to any party. It's how things are expressed to get you to believe something as opposed to believing something else, and seeing the person who is against you is not merely being wrong. And in the Bolshevik ideology, as we'll see later, it's not a matter just of being wrong. It's a matter of perverting the truth of the trajectory of human history or the truth of our philosophy. And I'll come back to that a little more when we get into that more deeply. Now, there was great difficulty in the home front pretty much everywhere with food shortages. And what this slide shows that I think is particularly helpful is to look at the legend underneath and see the scope of area that's involved with famine conditions in 1918. Famine. Now, there's a lot of land there. And you think, how is it they couldn't grow enough food? And other places that were bordering famine. How is that possible? Well, it's because of the centralization of the economies, the control over distributions, but also the destruction of the workforce to produce food. And by shutting down international trade, many of the things you needed in order to maintain a food supply were cut off. And we'll come to that in a slide later on. This became very severe. You'll see in the picture to the right there where it says searching for food in Persia, that they literally are scrounging for anything. You just got to have something. There were riots that took place in Russia. That's what you can see here on the left. And then on the right, you see where there were food riots that occurred in Germany in 1916. Now, the war is going to go on for almost 2 more years. Doesn't end, not in November 11th when the armistice was done. The Allies maintained a blockade of Germany much later until the Treaty of Versailles was signed. You're talking 6 months later. So there was starvation occurring in Germany after the end of the war. Part of the way in which things changed dramatically, particularly in Russia, had to do with the subversion of the Russian government very openly by the socialists and the communists, small c at this time, Bolsheviks, Mensheviks, the Social Revolutionary Party, the Socialist Democratic Party, and a whole bunch of others that had achieved a level of legitimacy. But what happened here at this particular factory was that in 1905, this had also been the site of great unrest. This is in Petrograd, which is the capital of the Russian Empire at this time. It didn't move to Moscow until much later. So here, one of the major factories for manufacturing things that were needed for the war was a site of unrest. And this was emphasized and promoted by people like Lenin and others. He's on that stage with his arm outstretched, exhorting the people to, in a sense, throw off their chains to revolt against the original government. Now, any questions from anybody at this particular point? I wanted to take this part of the first lecture and go over this in depth because from my perspective, both as I outlined in the very first set of slides on the goals of this particular set of lectures, but in particular to show that this transformation that occurs in 1917 is of profound significance, not just in the conduct of the war itself, but in what the 20th century and even the 21st century are going to be like. Okay. What we'll do is I'll go through where America enters the war, and then I'll get into the collapse of Russia after a break. We'll take a break here, after this section, because this isn't terribly long.
If anyone wishes to ask a question, you'll have to unmute yourself. at least temporarily. Please use your space bar if you have one to do it. And when you release it, you'll be back on mute.
Okay. So,
No questions, I guess.
no? Okay. I bring this slide up because I think it emphasizes a couple of very important parts. Notice the date, April 6, 1917. This is when America is going to enter the war, is April 1917. Now, unlike what happened in the Second World War, where at least FDR did some preliminary work to try to get America prepared for war, Wilson did almost nothing. Now, there were a variety of reasons for that, and I'll discuss them a little bit as we go forward and come closer to when we actually enter the war. But what I want you to look at here is the US Army, 127,151. National Guard, 181,620. If you think about it, in one day of the Battle of the Somme, the British had 60,000 casualties. That's half of the US Army. It's a third of the National Guard. So when you look at where the United States was, just when we're about to enter the war, you say, what could you possibly contribute? And remember that even though America had moved into becoming an industrial power and it had begun to assert its presence on the global stage as a result of the Spanish-American War, we still were in many ways militarily, except for the Navy, a backwater. The biggest conflict we'd had since the Spanish-American War was our incursions into Mexico to look for Pancho Villa and help suppress the rebels that were fighting there and coming across into our border. And this man, Black Jack Pershing, led that. But within a year, and by the end of the war, you can see the numbers. We'd gone up to 2 million on the Western Front. We were developing millions more at home should the war persist into 1919. An incredible mobilization, which could only take place with extraordinary central government control. But here's the other part. Unlike World War II, where we were called by FDR the arsenal for democracy, we had an empty safe. We had to get nearly all of our weapons, certainly all our airplanes, and nearly literally every piece of artillery from the French and British. We did not have the transport. Many of the transports had to be given to us or used through the British. Our own shipbuilding capabilities, which were huge in World War II, contributed very little to this war. So the idea that we were an economic power in World War I really was not the case at all. We had money, we could give loans, and indeed many of those countries almost to this day still owe us money based on the two World War conflicts, but that's a different point altogether. What I want to emphasize is Wilson at the time was completely unprepared in the sense that he never took the steps to prepare this country for entering the war. Now, you've heard about, and we'll talk about unrestricted submarine warfare in a little bit, but you've also heard about the Zimmermann telegram. And basically what this was the German foreign minister at the time, Zimmermann, trying to get Mexico to attack the United States if the United States declared war against Germany, and also to use Mexico to try to talk to the Japanese to see if the Japanese could raise a ruckus in the Pacific, which would draw our attention off in that direction. Even though Japan was technically an ally of the French and British and so on, an ally, and had taken over German possessions, it was pretty clear the Japanese were interested in East Asia and the Western Pacific as we looked at it. They weren't that interested in having anything to do with the conflict in Europe. They could care less. In fact, the more damage that was done over there, the better for them, because it would weaken the holdings of the Dutch and the British and the French in Asia. This would open their door. I show you the original telegram because this had to be deciphered into this print, which I think is something I have no understanding about how they do it. But here's the other interesting sidelight. The Zimmerman telegram was sent to Mexico over US cables, diplomatic cables, and intercepted by the British, not by us. And it was only after a considerable period of time for the British not to reveal that they were intercepting cables on our network that they told the Americans about it and prompted the response, which in part contributed to our entry into the war. More importantly, fundamentally, was the development of unrestricted warfare. Now, look at it from the German perspective. The Germans were blockaded by the British Navy. The amount of imports that they could get was severely restricted. The way in which they got any at all was either down through the Baltic from Scandinavian countries, which had minerals but didn't have food, or through the Netherlands, which maintained its neutrality. Now, in terms of getting food to the Netherlands, though, you had to traverse through the North Sea, or you had to come up the channel, and the British weren't about to let you do that. So they declared, the British, essentially a war zone, which allowed them to intercept any merchant ship. They could stop it, they could investigate its cargo, they could, if they wished, intern it in British waters or even sink it. What did Germany have to refute that? Well, they had the High Seas Fleet, but they'd already tried to break out in the Battle of Jutland and were forced back to port. There was no way they were going to get surface raiders out into the Atlantic and be able to intercept traffic out there. They had a few ships that got out. Most of them were hunted down and sunk. But once the Battle of Jutland was over, the German fleet was basically stuck in place with only a few very pinprick type raids against the English coast. But what did Germany have? Submarines. Limited in their range, limited in their torpedo carrying capacity, though developments later in the war improved both of those elements. The one thing that the submarine could do was get out into the Atlantic and intercept merchant ships. If this was not permitted by the German government, they were essentially allowing themselves to be blockaded without anything on the converse against Britain. Arguments were bitter and intense in Germany over the issue of this kind of restriction and whether to lift it and go to unrestricted submarine warfare or not. It was very bitter, very hotly contested. And eventually the Hindenburg-Ludendorff combination won out over Bethmann Hollweg, who was the chancellor at the time, and defeated him to such a degree that he ended up actually finally being kicked out and replaced. But the important part—
What were the arguments?
I'm sorry?
What were the arguments?
Who were they arguing?
No, what were the arguments on both sides?
On both sides, the primary concern Bethmann Hollweg had this would bring America into the war and would be insufficient to really disrupt trade. On the other hand, the German Naval Command, as well as Hindenburg and Ludendorff, felt that they could bring England to its knees by starvation within 6 months, long before the Americans, even if they joined in the war, would be able to have any particular effect on the fighting in the Western Front, which is where the main effect was going to be of any American intervention. The Americans weren't going to end up in Egypt or Palestine or, anywhere else. They were going to come to France. And actually, when you look at the statistics for what happened during the initial onslaught of unrestricted submarine warfare, given the technological deficiencies that existed at the time, the amount of damage they did was substantial. And when you look at the British response to it, it was indeed, as Wellington said at the Battle of Waterloo, a close run thing. And it was only because of the different changes that took place, particularly with the convoy system and things of that nature, that they were finally able to defeat the submarine menace. But it was very serious as far as the initial effects went. And when you remember that it took over almost a year entirely for the Americans to become any factor at all, any, not just major. The United States was never a major factor in World War I. Became a significant factor, it took a year. So the Germans actually predicted that remarkably accurately. Where they failed was the response the British finally took with a convoy system to be able to defeat the submarine threat. But it was close. Now, when Wilson was finally convinced, based on unrestricted submarine warfare and the Zimmerman telegram, to declare war, one of the things I want to emphasize through this speech that he gave asking for the declaration of war is down at the bottom. To fight thus for the ultimate peace of the world and the liberation of its peoples, the German peoples included, for the rights of nations, great and small, and the privilege of men everywhere to choose their way of life. And I've got something in the way of that last little bit. I hope you all can see the last phrase. I can't see it on mine. That's an ideological statement. Wilson has really not said anything at this particular time frame which really threatens or indicates a threat to United States sovereignty. Now think about it from this perspective. Remove the ideology, remove that last set that I've outlined there. Was the United States going to be invaded by Mexico? No. I mean, nobody would take that seriously. Even the Mexicans didn't take it seriously. They kind of looked at it and said, you got to be kidding me. We've had so much trouble in our country up to this point. We can barely control what's been happening in the northern half. That's why the Americans came down there with Pershing. We're not about to go invade the United States. We're certainly not going to take over New Mexico and Arizona and Southern California. Give me a break. Japan, you got to be kidding me. What do they care? They don't want to get in a fight with the United States. They'll just gobble up what they can. So there's no threat there to United States sovereignty. Now, what about freedom of the seas? Well, you're talking about interrupting trade, okay, by American shipping. But nothing says that the British ships, and the French ships, and even the German ships, if they could reach it, could come to the United States and load up goods. And we could still use our ships to trade elsewhere in the world. Spain, Portugal, Africa, wherever, South America, we could do all that. So why are we in this fight? What's the purpose? What's the ultimate goal that requires the United States to declare war on Germany? We can tell Germany, listen, we're going to ignore, or not ignore, we're going to accept that you've put a cordon around England and the northern coast of France, and that's a no-go place. Okay, we'll buy that until the war's over. Where's the threat to American sovereignty? There isn't one. And indeed, in passing the declaration of war, it was not unanimous. It wasn't like World War II, where only one person, and that was a woman named Ransom, maybe? She was from Montana, voted against it. Here, the opposition, while certainly small, was not insignificant. So ideology is the key issue that we're looking at. Somehow or another, Wilson is coloring this, that if the Germans win this war, there's going to be an ideological transformation in the way the world runs. But Germany never was seeking, as it was in World War II, to impose a particular ideology on the rest of the world. It was looking for control of territory. And that's a very different principle from the principle of let's have ultimate peace in the world and liberation of its peoples. Germany didn't, at this point, want to enslave the rest of the world. That wasn't their point. Never stated at any particular time. When we shift to ideology, ideology moves front and center to the way Germany and then the USSR will behave and put themselves in conflict with the rest of the world, which now embraces the ideology of so-called democracy. Those are the critical issues that are of great importance here. So what happens is we have the Selective Service. We have to start signing people up. There was still great enthusiasm for Americans to join. There certainly was no lack of that. And I make this particular note that Black soldiers participated, but were segregated. And this was only partly due to Wilson. It wasn't the Jim Crow laws. That was inapplicable in terms of the federal government.
Mike,
When you look, yes.
before you get into this too deeply, perhaps it's a good time for a break. It's 10 after, almost 3 minutes past 7, so it's been
Okay. I'll just show this last slide. The Yanks are coming. You can see that they're getting there, and we'll leave this particular thing up here. We won't come back till it's over there. We'll take a short break. I'll stay here if people have questions. You want to say just 5 minutes, Henry?
Yeah.
Time to get to the bathroom and back, or?
That I think you've lost him.
Yeah, no, that's fine. That's fine. I just forgot to unmute myself.
No,
Okay, I'm going to kill the recording until we come back.
okay.
Well, Michael, I wanted to make an observation. You know, a couple of years ago, I did a program on Russian nationalism.
Uh-huh.
And when I went through that, I came to the realization that the origin of nation is born. Native, you're a native of where you were born.
Uh-huh.
Natal, those things. And I recognize that what makes a nation is the shared view, origin story. In other words, either literally, you know, we're the children of Abraham, or figuratively that, you know, our fathers fought and bled at Bunker Hill and Valley Forge. You know, those are the origin stories. And they're maybe ahistorical, but they have to be, have to exist. And I read a biography of Noah Webster, and it made it clear that the founding fathers recognized this, and they deliberately created an origin story, a history, and they made George Washington, all of the made up stories about him, making him a mythological hero, you know, all of that. And, and I think what's breaking down the national unity now is not political division. It is ideological division, as you says, but the disintegration of the origin myth. Example, the 1619 Project.
You make some excellent points, and I think as you already understand, the answer is somewhat more complex. One of the things I do in my own mind sometimes in thinking about these areas is I go back to I'll call it our basic anthropology or biology. We started as clans.
Sure.
We had us and then everybody else.
Mm-hmm.
Our survival depended upon a kind of social structure within our clan that kept us together in the face of danger.
Yes.
Allowed us to do the things which we needed to survive. Other clans were a threat. But once we started to transition into the development of agriculture, we expanded that small clan into what we would call small communities, because it took shared effort in order to make agriculture work. And I'm talking about before we get to agricultural civilizations, which comes much later. In terms of how you establish a thought process, I think you're right. You need that historical narrative in order to teach each coming generation your link to that past, sense your obligations to that past, also to incorporate the values that occur as expressed in past actions, but transition through to the future. What I'm concerned about if we started a conversation about where is our country headed, where is the world headed altogether, it's that, as you point out, the narratives that we grew up with when we were kids has been undermined by newer narratives. Now, that can be a good thing because it makes us more acutely aware of the faults and foibles that existed in that previous time frame. But at the same time, there are certain values that have permeated this country, at least, again, from a very personal perspective, up until recently, that meant no matter where you came from, didn't matter what your background was, if you embrace those American values, that was sufficient to make you an American. And we look at how many different, I'll call it ethnic groups, joined in. We saw it in part already with the picture of the Black soldiers joining up to fight for America when they were stuck in a very racist society, or what happened in World War II, Japanese Americans whose families were interned in camps and lost their livelihoods, lost their homes, their goods, stuck in a camp, joined up in the American Army, and indeed one of their units became one of the most decorated units in the entire US Army.
Yes.
So when we look at all those different elements, it's because there were certain shared values, even if we weren't living them at the time. The destruction of a nation, and we'll see this in part when we come to Russia and what's happening in Russia, is, as I pointed out in that comparison slide between John Lennon and Karl Marx, is that you destroy the past. When you destroy the past, everything now is based purely on the narrative we've established in the present.
Mm-hmm.
You don't adhere to that narrative, then we can judge you as other, and we can do what we want with you because you're not adhering to the truth. In the text that I write when I develop all these slides, I don't read the text to you because it's, you know, I just don't like reading. I mean, that's just boring. But I do draw a comparison with the wars of religion in the 1600s.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And there, the concept is this: I own the truth. If you deviate from this, you not only are not acknowledging the truth, you are actually working for evil. And if you look at certain levels of fundamentalism as expressed by, say, the Taliban or Al-Qaeda or others, one of the things you come back to is the concept that from their perspective, they own the truth. Any deviation becomes an act against God and must be stopped, because what you're doing is leading people astray into evil.
That only goes so far though, Doc. I missed the beginning of this discussion, but I did hear nationalism from Tom Elliott on the part of the Russian. And I would say that if you took that and applied it in Russia in World War II, it was Russian nationalism that saved Russia, not communism, not the ideology, and the communists themselves did not use their own ideology to motivate their people.
I don't disagree that in the time of World War II, that was the case. But what you have to look at is what preceded it and what happened afterward.
Well,
For
what
example-
preceded it was the German invasion of Russia.
If you were a prisoner of war, a Russian prisoner of war with Germany, when you returned back to the Soviet Union, you were not embraced as having returned home. You were viewed as corrupted by Germany. And the treatment of those returning POWs was harsh, to say.
Well, that was an attempt to regain control over the populace. I agree with you. But when you
Right.
needed to motivate them to fight against an overwhelmingly adroit force, such as Germany was when it invaded Russia in World War II,
Well,
and threatened them in World War I.
yes, I understand, and I know that Stalin made the big plea to support Mother Russia and the rest of it, but you have to look at the other part of that, and that is how the KGB and the NKVD functioned during World War II. It's not proper for us to get into that, but I'll tell you that there are more than just anecdotes. I mean, there's a huge amount of archival information that shows just how brutal these people would be towards anyone they thought was not adhering to the proper ideology. Now, remember, the ideology is shaped by those at the top, so they can do what they wish to change the narrative, but it's how it affects you down at the lower level. And ultimately, both in Nazi Germany in particular and the Soviet Union, the idea was you have to learn how to think.
Yes.
Otherwise, to use a phrase from a number of Christian organizations, I have sinned in thought, in word, and in deed. And this becomes the ideological basis for what goes on as expressed in the Soviet Union and, to a fair degree now, current in communist China.
Mm-hmm.
This
Yeah.
is not something that can be blown off. All right, I think have most people returned?
Yeah.
Okay, very good. Then we'll go on to this next part. The collapse of Russia. One of the things that is of critical importance is that the Russian government at this particular time had already been undermined to a fair degree, but it was hanging on. Part of the undermining occurred because Tsar Nicholas became the acknowledged commander-in-chief of the Russian armies. Therefore, there was no insulation between what happened on the Eastern Front and himself. Prior to this, he could at least blame somebody else. In addition, because he was more comfortable dealing with the military aspects, incompetent as he was at a number of different levels, he ignored the home front. And I alluded to that in the first lecture when I showed some of the issues that were going on in the Russian government, particularly the comment by a fellow named Miluakov, who basically stood up in the Duma and charged certain people whom Tsar Nicholas had appointed to positions of power as being either stupid or traitors. This is the kind of undermining that was going on, but the fervent was even deeper than this. The Social Revolutionary Party, the Bolshevik Party, the Menshevik Party were all agitating against the Tsar because their particular goals were to get rid of the Tsar, get rid of that form of government. And even more so, the Bolsheviks, and Lenin in particular, though he hasn't yet returned to Russia at this point, he's still in Switzerland, is basically advocating that Russia leave the war. He wants the war ended. He doesn't care about the rest of it. In 1916, the Brusilov offensive took a fair amount of territory, counterattacks, pushed them back nearly to their starting lines. Casualties were enormous. This was a very, very painful part for Russia to experience. And going into 1917, while they had made great strides in being able to support the fighting at the front, the morale at home was deteriorating sharply, and a good part of this could be laid at the feet of the Tsar because of his level and frankly incompetence in dealing with the domestic front. Part of this was his own personal nature. Part of this was because he deferred considerably to his wife, Alexandra, who was influenced substantially by Rasputin. And Rasputin's particular influence even led to the selection or demotion of very senior people running various ministries. The Russian aristocracy that surrounded the Tsar saw this happening, couldn't influence it unless they got on Alexandra's good side or Rasputin's good side. Similarly, couldn't budge the Tsar particularly. And the Tsar was also not trained adequately to be a military commander, but he'd stuck himself at the front of the charge, if you will, and therefore the catastrophes that would happen were going to be laid at his feet personally. We tend not to understand the nature of these casualties, particularly when we compare them to World War II, but we have to remember populations were much less. And this represents a lot of casualties of the young men who were necessary to run the fields and grow the food and run the factories and the rest of it. I have this slide, which is fairly complex. Obviously, I'm not going to read it to you. But what I want to point out is that going back as far as 1880, the Russian government, in terms of its domestic policies, began to show a great degree of instability. There was certainly, as I alluded to earlier in this lecture, a drive to increase representation, to liberalize the various elements of society, especially in Russia. And as a result, they legitimized certain particular organizations. When they became legitimized, their agendas became legitimate, even if contested. And once they became part of government, even if they were a relatively unimportant element, they nonetheless now had a voice. And that voice could be used to spread the word throughout the rest of the general population. It's also important to recognize, as I mentioned here in 1903, Lenin declares the creation of the Bolshevik Party to overthrow capitalism and create a workers' paradise. This is a very distinct threat, not just to the Russian government and the Russian society or political nation as such, but globally. And that is a very important element to occur. Up to the war, Russia was still hanging on but struggling. Inconsistencies in the management of domestic affairs further undermined any support for the government. It just became chaotic. And at that point, you just said, screw them. You know, I'm not going to listen to them. I'm going to listen to somebody who offers more. And I thought this particular section of a poem by William Butler Yeats, The Second Coming, although it's written in 1921, really reflects what is happening in Russia in particular, but it's actually happening globally as well, and will be even more pronounced after the war ends. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer, things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world, the blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. This explains everything that's going on in 1917.
And for the last 4 years.
You can throw that in, Henry. I won't go there. Okay. In 1917, just again, to talk about the collapse of Russia, there's a problem many of us have with, we're dealing with dates. There's the old style calendar and the new style calendar. The new style calendar is 13 days earlier than the old style. It screws up all of the terminology. I'm going to go through this very quickly. The point is that in February, things are so bad that basically those supporters of Tsar Nicholas come to him and say, you got to go. There's no more support for you in this country. Tsar Nicholas initially thinks maybe he can let his son have it, which is ridiculous because the son is a hemophiliac and he's not likely to make it past 15 with that condition. And then he says, well, that's not going to work. How about my uncle? And his uncle turns it down, and they decide that he's just got to leave and there'll be a new government that's formed. There are mutinies that take place in Petrograd, a lot of demonstrations and strikes. It becomes an issue where the military sides with the strikers, where they say, we're not going to shoot these people. We're not going to stop them. This isn't 1905 where we're going to go out and shoot a bunch of people. And as a result, Petrograd, which is the capital, in a sense, falls to mobs. And it's only through a great deal of effort that eventually there's a government formed. But it is weak and it is broken. Its ability to function is severely torn up by the contesting parties that make it up: the social revolutionaries, the Bolsheviks, the Mensheviks, and the Socialist Democrats, as well as those who are still in support of the Tsar. It's chaos. And because it's chaos, Germany sees what's going on. It's not as though this is hidden from sight. They know who Lenin is, and they know about his power and influence in Russia. Think about the Ayatollah Khomeini, who spent 7 years in Paris writing missives to Iran. And what happens when the Shah is overthrown is Khomeini goes back and he becomes the leader of Iran. The Germans back in 1917 saw an opportunity. Their predictions, the Germans' predictions on how the war would go, as I alluded to in the first lecture, was that we're running into real trouble of conducting this war. If we can force Russia out, then the vast majority of those troops and supplies, resources, everything that's devoted to fighting the Russians can be brought to the West. What did they do? They not only arranged for Lenin to traverse Germany and get into Russia quietly and secretly, because he can't be seen as directly coming from Germany. They actually use a circuitous route to get him there, but they give him lots of money. Now, what is he going to do with the money? One of the first things he does when he lands is he buys a printing press. Now he can literally produce papers, pamphlets, and disseminate them. So he becomes a factor, even though he was known, but he was really not appreciated personally for his work until he's actually there physically, and he oversees this dissemination of Bolshevik propaganda to convince the people the war must end. Now, he's not powerful enough to make it happen, as you'll see down here. In fact, in July, he almost ends up destroying his own initiative. There's an attempted coup that takes place. It arises rather spontaneously as a result of the failure of the Kerensky offensive. We'll come to that later. But in particular, when Lenin tries to co-opt this effect and use it as a coup attempt, he's rebuffed, and he actually has to flee to Finland for a period of time. Shortly after this happens, General Kornilov, who has been called to come up to Petrograd initially by the government to help suppress this coup attempt, is now talking about coming to Petrograd and setting up a dictatorship in order to control the government. So this is like a march on Washington, okay? Only these are armed troops coming. Well, Kerensky is able, through a variety of machinations, to fire Kornilov. But when he fires him, a lot of the Russian generals, the senior generals, basically say to Kerensky, screw you. You're just destroying this country. You have no idea what you're doing. And now you've pissed off the military, which was your last resort for remaining in power. So what does Kerensky do? He reaches back out to the Bolsheviks and he reinstitutes Lenin and the Bolsheviks back into the government. And within a short period of time afterward, as you'll see, this goes into August, September, Kerensky's gone and the Bolsheviks take power. There are a lot of machinations that take place that we're not covering here, but it's a fascinating element. And this is a little bit more of some of the detail that happens because I think it's relevant to look at this. At the time that Kerensky had reintegrated the Bolsheviks, it was pretty clear that the constitutional government of the Duma was ineffective, just wasn't working. So they created an executive branch, but even the executive branch got into squabbles among itself. And pretty soon edicts were being offered by the different parties as though they were in charge. One of the most destructive ones was this one called Order Number 1. Initially, it told all of the military organizations to return to barracks. Now you can imagine the effect that this would have if you're in the front line and you've been facing the Germans for the last 3 years, taking a pounding, and you're thinking, return to barracks? Hey, that sounds like a great idea. Screw this war, I'm out of here, right? Only it wasn't meant to apply to the front line, but that's how it was disseminated. And indeed, within 48 hours, they tried to reverse the order and say, no, it only applies to the units in Petrograd to return to the barracks so we can have some calm in the city. And as Trotsky says, Order Number 1 was indestructible. But notice what it also did. It stripped officers of their authorities in the sense that Soviets, these are committees, not the kind of Soviet Union we're talking about, it's a different kind of use of the word, was designed to put a political spin on any decisions made by officers. They had to be consistent with everything that was coming from whoever was in charge. And at that point, nobody knew who was in charge. And Order Number 3 then put all military units under control of the executive committee and commissars were appointed to link up with the military commanders and see that they adhered to the proper orders of the executive committee. The executive committee was not made up of a great many people, and it was very ideologically based. So we keep this in mind as an example of the utter chaos that was affecting Russia at the time of 1917, why it collapsed, and how the Bolsheviks managed to gain power when previously they had almost literally been destroyed in that failed coup attempt in July. Just another set of things. I'm not going to draw this out. In fact, I'm going to go past this and just show this particular thing, because the emphasis in this slide is what's on the left. Cattle, way down. Horses, way down. Pigs, way down. War debts, $4,000 million. I think that's in money of the time, and that's probably at least hundreds of billions of dollars, if not low trillion dollars in terms of actual value. It also shows on the right just a number of things that were going on, the extent of the conflict, where most of the fighting had occurred. That's not of great importance to us at this particular time. But when you look at the expanse of Russia, and you say, what had you really lost? What you'd really lost was a lot of Poland and not so much of Russia itself. But the transformation of relationships was key. And with this, discipline eroded rapidly. The number of desertions that occurred, the number of actual shootings of officers who resisted the initiatives put forth by their soldiers, the fraternization that was taking place were extensive. Now, in southern portion of the front, this was less an issue. There seemed to be better discipline and better control. But the closer you got to Petrograd, the worse the situation became. Ultimately, and I showed you this picture before, the Bolsheviks gained power and used this particular phrase, bread, land, and peace, in order to be able to eventually create a situation of getting a ceasefire. More and more archives were uncovered, distributed to the general public, showing some of the secret negotiations that were attempted in the earlier sections that I talked about to achieve peace with Germany or Austria-Hungary. This particular set of initiatives was now seen as perverse, even though Lenin wanted an end to the war at almost any cost. I always like this slide because if you look in the back, you wonder, is that the Capitol building? Kerensky's offensive in 1917 was the last major attempt on the part of Russia to engage in the war. When we talked about this in the first lecture, we said Russia had agreed in the Chantilly Conference of December 1916 to participate in an offensive against the Germans to help keep them locked in place, prevent them from shifting troops to the Western Front, where the big initiative under Nivelle was to take place to hopefully destroy the German armies on the Western Front. Kerensky, in spite of the chaos, in spite of the abdication of the Tsar and the disruption within government, felt obligated to try to adhere to this. Therefore, the offensive became known as the Kerensky Offensive, which again meant there was no separation between him and the catastrophe that resulted. And even though the casualties that were inflicted on both sides were relatively small by comparison to the casualties that had been experienced earlier, it was a little bit like the straw that broke the camel's back. Here was another major attempt that accomplished practically nothing of significance. The territory taken was almost immediately lost in counterattacks. And it was pretty clear that morale on the front was down to its lowest limits. And you may remember, those of you who are familiar with World War I, the same was happening over in France at this particular time, where morale was down in the toilet. This shows you a little more graphically down here in this particular lower section on the left of the territory that initially was gained and then lost. This was supposed to be an offensive. You're supposed to gain ground. Well, they didn't gain much of anything. Indeed, they lost some. And up here in the northern section, the Germans launched a particular attack against the city of Riga, which was also an important port, and quickly destroyed the Russian defenders there. This had great implications in what was going to happen in 1918. We won't get into that right now. This just shows a little more closely the effect of the Russian attack and then the counterattacks, the Austrian and German counterattacks that actually drove them farther back. Although still much of the territory lost was really not native Russia at this particular time. So territorial losses were not that great. And if you look down here at casualties, for this whole time of the fighting, which was going on for almost a month, this is what the British lost in one day at the Somme in 1916. So by most standards, not considered bad, but the implications were what were bad. When this finally failed, this particular offensive, what we see in this particular slide is that there were now areas of great dissent rising up very quickly within Russia of groups that wanted autonomy. The biggest one was down in the Ukraine region. And this created great difficulties for the central government because, like the poem indicated, the center cannot hold. Things are beginning to fly away. Anarchy is beginning to reign throughout Russia. This is truly becoming anarchy of sorts. There's no particular powerful hand, and that's the only way this is going to be controlled, is eventually if somebody puts such a grip on the rest of the country that it eliminates the oppositions. And it's going to take the Russian Civil War to do that. The timeline here, as I outlined, is that the final events take place in October or November in the new calendar. So you'll see the parade that Russia has in November rather than in October. And at this particular time, it's really a matter of a final coup attempt. It really isn't very bloody. In fact, there's a rather interesting comment that when I think it was Eisenstein filmed the October Revolution as a movie, he had more casualties than actually took place during the actual revolution. It was that bloodless as things went. But shortly after this happens, within a very short period of time, as you can see in December, Russia and the Central Powers agree to a ceasefire. And they begin negotiations a short time later at Brest-Litovsk. This is an attempt, a very specific attempt for Russia to get out of the war. Now, the important element here is this. The Bolshevik Party is now firmly in control of the government, though they're not in control of the country. We have to keep that in mind. Lenin feels the only way to salvage the authority of the government ultimately to gain control of the country is to sign a peace treaty. So the negotiations start out with a little back and forth, Trotsky actually representing a lot of the Russian side of it, and Trotsky getting to the point of walking out of the deliberation saying, the war's over, and he just walks out. And the Germans kind of look at this like, what? Well, if you're leaving, we're just going to pile a bunch of soldiers onto troop trains, and we're just going to drive those trains into Russia, and we're going to occupy more territory. So they do that. There's basically not much fighting, if any. They're just going in to occupy territory. Lenin finally says, Trotsky, get your butt back at the negotiating table, find out what they want, give it to them, because we have to consolidate our hold over the government and then over the rest of the country. And then they move the capital to Moscow because Petrograd is a disaster. It's just chaos, chaos, chaos. And we need it consolidated, and we're going to do that in Moscow instead. Ultimately, and it's unclear sometimes, but it's, I think, presumed with some accuracy that Tsar Nicholas and his family now are executed because they want absolutely no possibility of the Romanov family returning to power. You just got to get rid of them. And this is the best way to do it. So they're all shot down in a basement, and then their bodies are taken out and burned and gotten rid of so that there's nothing that anybody will, this is a martyr place kind of thing. They want to eliminate that. So what happens as a result of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk? Some historians say that because of the harsh nature of these terms, this served as a prelude, if you will, to what the Allies would impose on Germany in the Treaty of Versailles. I'm not sure I buy that, but it's an interesting argument. Basically, what it does is it gives up an enormous amount of territory, as you can see in the shaded areas up here, for example, gives away enormous amounts of territory to the Central Powers to control or to be at least pseudo-independent. There'll be some control in the Ukraine because there's an arrangement made where the Ukraine is recognized as separate from Russia, as we see nowadays, where Ukraine is separate from Russia. But the Ukraine was to supply a great deal of food to the Central Powers, but to be helped and protected from Russia by German authority and Austro-Hungarian authority. In addition, they wanted to have various territories that would be annexed down the road, that the Russians would agree to these things. A lot of that, of course, went away when Germany lost the war. Importantly, therefore, the armistice is signed, as I said, in December. The treaty is finally signed. The Germans have occupied a great deal of territory, as you can see in the shaded region here. And basically, Russia is forced from the war completely. The important part of all of this is that there is actually not a great deal of Russian territory per se that is lost in this treaty, but it is still a sticking point for Russians who looked at the Russian Empire as theirs, and now it's been broken up. And the question arises from their standpoint is, are we going to be able to recapture those areas? The Baltic states in particular had always been rebellious in nature, and now they're given their own kind of autonomy. Poland is in a sense going to be resurrected. The Germans hadn't intended it to be, but in one sense, that was what was going to be a result. And even Hindenburg said later on, we need control of the Baltics and of Poland for the next war. This is before the war ends and before Germany is lost. So some of these men are thinking ahead of the serious implications of what's coming next. The rise of Bolshevism is part of this animosity. There'd always been tension between Russia and Germany and things of that nature. I won't go into those dynamics here. That's old history that we talked about in the prelude to World War I, as well as to some of the issues in the last lectures from 1914 to 1916. But the critical part here is now there's a clear ideological break. The monarchy in Russia's overthrown. It's destroyed. The monarchy still exists in Germany, though that will disappear, as the monarchy exists in Austria-Hungary. That will disappear when they lose the war. But what they see on the other side of that borderline is a revolution which in its very nature and expressed by its leaders is to be global in scope. And I suspect that part of Hindenburg's comment about the next war was related to this ideological basis that was a clear difference between what Russia would be under the Bolsheviks and what it would be in comparison to Germany and Austria-Hungary. The other part that I'll only mention briefly right now is that as Russia collapsed and the war came to an end, the British, the Japanese, and the Americans all, in a sense, attacked different parts of Russia in order to try to destroy the Bolsheviks, at least to assist the rebellion of the whites against the Reds and to get rid of the Reds. They saw the whites as less demonic, if you will. You keep that in mind because there's an underappreciation of the power of this ideology and the concerns that were present in all of the countries involved in this conflict, where they were dealing with socialist and even communist organizations. They just didn't have as much voice here as they did in Russia at the time. Other conditions, this is interesting. Russia lost 34% of its population, 54% of its industrial line, 89% of its coal fields. And they were fined 300 million gold marks. Now, to try to figure out what that means today, that's probably close to $1 trillion. That's more than the GDP of Russia almost at the time, okay? That's like saying the United States, you've got a GDP of 18 trillion. You owe us all of that as indemnification. Plus, we're taking away a lot of your territory. So how you're going to pay it is a whole different ballgame. Soviets reputed the bonds. So this ended up creating a real problem in terms of how you're going to support your economy. What money do you have to run it? How are you going to pay the people who are in government? How are you going to pay your soldiers? And so on and so forth. And there's, to me, a really fascinating element to look into the details of how does a government actually function when you're up against this kind of problem. And to me, it's almost miraculous, not necessarily favorably, as to how the Bolsheviks managed to do this and win the Civil War, which they almost lost. I mean, it's just extraordinary. I bring this up as we get near the end of this particular set of lectures because I want to point out something. This is Lenin's own thesis. Now, it wasn't adopted until 1919 when the Bolsheviks consolidated their power after they had signed the treaty to end the fight and to get into the beginnings of the Civil War. But if you read through this, just to point out in a couple of very quick things, unmask social patriotism and social pacifism, root out people whose ideas are in conflict with ours. This is getting into how do I do groupthink in a way, all right? Communist cells must be created in all labor organization and be subordinated to the party. We are in charge. Everybody is to behave according to our directives. And these down here outline that same thing. All press organs must print all important documents of the executive committee. This is a form of propaganda. This is telling you what our government is going to do. And as you look these over, you'll also see must have iron discipline, full authority and power. Communist parties occasionally must purge themselves. Now think about that and to how it was applied in reality. None of these have any particular influence if you're not willing to back them up with force. And that ultimately becomes what we see expressed in the Soviet Union as it develops in the 20s and 30s. Now, we come to military operations, and in part, what I'm going to do is just run through a couple of quick slides to show the beginnings of the military side of 1917. And then I will not try to get into the Western Front and other fronts. I'll save that for the next lecture. What my intent is to cover 1917 military aspects in the next lecture, 1918 in the last set of lectures, with a little coda related to the various treaties that were finally signed at the end of the war. What I want to emphasize here in the few minutes remaining to today's lecture is this is truly a global war, in the sense that you begin to see on this declarations of war in 1917, how many countries signed on to the war. Now, that doesn't mean they contributed very much. In fact, most of them had very little to contribute when you really come down to it. The interesting part is to look that on April 6th, the US declares war on Germany. The US at that point did not declare war on Austria-Hungary. It did not declare war on Turkey. Didn't declare war on Bulgaria. Those were left out. And the other part that people forget, and I have to admit, it took rereading for me to remember this. The United States did not become a formal ally of Britain and France and Italy. It was an associated power, and that had certain legal implications as well as diplomatic implications, even though we tend to meld the two as an ally versus an associated power. An associated power was said specifically to keep us distinct from France and Britain and Italy in terms of conduct of the war. This had great importance for how 1917, but particularly 1918 went on. You'll also see that even China declared war on Germany and Austria-Hungary. I think there were some Chinese units that actually ended up on the Western Front or in Salonika. I forget, maybe it was Salonika. But again, their contribution was very limited, but the idea is this is a global fight. Let's get in it. Let's see what we can do. We certainly can throw our hat in the ring, even if it doesn't cost us anything to do that. Turkey didn't declare war on the US. They just severed relations, and that was fine with us. We didn't have much to do with them anyway. The timeline here is just to outline very quickly some of the things that happened during the 1917 timeframe. The particular things have to do with where certain gains were made, such as the British finally capturing Baghdad in March and things of this sort. We'll talk about those a little more deeply when we come to the actual events that occur. But the critical things are the Nivelle offensive on the Western Front, the collapse temporarily, fortunately, of French morale and the troubles that they faced in order to get themselves back into the fight, and more particularly, how the war specifically transformed. And I'm going to take a minute to talk about that in a different way. I show this because the terms that often show up when you're reading in terms of the geography of France can be very confusing. Picardy is here, Champagne here, Pas-de-Calais, and so on and so forth. We tend to sometimes forget where these are in relationship to France, and it can be confusing when you're reading about the battles taking place in various locations. So anyone who wants a reference, this is a slide that'll help you with that. This is just a blow up of it to show where most of the fighting took place on that frontier. Now, to address something a little bit different. The war in the Western Front had been relatively static. There was very little transformation of territory back and forth once the trenches were dug from the Channel to the Swiss border. The advances were measured in a couple miles, perhaps. And really, this particular static warfare, which was really emphasized in the fighting at Verdun and the fighting on the Somme in 1916, creates an aura for most people reading about World War I that that's all it was. And I also emphasized at the beginning of the last lecture that the armies were designed initially for maneuver warfare, which is how the war started, through maneuver. It wasn't, none of the armies were designed for this kind of static warfare. So here's a concept I want you to keep in mind. This is now siege warfare. This is as though you're going to attack a fortified city, only instead of the city being readily, easily defined and surrounded, you've got a wall that's hundreds of miles long. So how do you beat a fortified city? How do you take it? Well, one of the things you have to do is you have to cut the city off from resupply and reinforcement. Well, how do you do that here? Well, that's part of the blockade. That's part of having different fronts, the Eastern Front with Russia, the Southern Front against Italy, and in the Balkans until Serbia is destroyed, you've only got Salonika there. In other words, you want to challenge Germany, the Central Powers, on all sides. You need an effect to surround them. The blockade is another part of that. So you have to cut them off from resupply and reinforcement. The second thing you have to do when you want to take a fortified city is you have to breach the walls. Well, how do you do that? Well, history shows us a lot of different techniques. One of the techniques is to bring up artillery and batter the walls down. Now, in the older days, and we're talking now just going back into the 1800s, you did that simply by massing some artillery and blasting away at the walls. And as you shattered the walls, you created what is called a breach. Once you had the breach, you would send in infantry. And the infantry was known in the British Army when they attacked that breach as a forlorn hope. Why were they called that? Because they were expected to take terrible casualties. But their job was to get into the breach, hold it, while follow-on troops could come forward. And the follow-on troops would follow through, get into the heart of the city, past the defenses, and then they could destroy the opponents and conquer the city. Unfortunately, when you're firing artillery at a wall and you're trying to break it down, one of the responses on the part of the defender is to build another wall behind it. So while you shatter the front wall, now when you attack, you hit another wall. And there you're actually trapped. You're caught into a crossfire, a killing zone. This is what was happening on the Western Front. You'd breach, you'd get in, there'd be another wall. And you'd be caught in this crossfire and the casualties would be enormous. So the initial response was bring up more artillery, batter it more, create a wider breach. You need to get this thing not just in terms of a few yards, you have to get miles in order to have a breach sufficient that the flanking fire won't destroy those oncoming troops. That's one way to do it. And that was their initial attempt. How else do you do it? Well, you undermine the walls. This happened at Constantinople, for example, in 1463 or 1483, I forget the exact date. You dig underneath the walls and you collapse them. And once you have gunpowder, you dig under the walls, and the British did this in some of their fighting in Spain, and you pack it with explosives and you blow it up. And remember that in the Civil War, during the battles for Petersburg, one of the great actions taken was exactly that. Dig underneath the Confederate defenses and blow it up. That was the big battle of the Crater that some of you may have heard of. So now siege warfare is reaching a whole new perspective of engagement. And we'll see the pinnacle of that when we see what the British do at Messines Ridge in 1917. But there are still enormous innovations taking place. And this isn't just a matter of technology and tank warfare and things of that sort. It's much more complex than that. And we won't have time to go into it here. It's now 8 o'clock. For those of you who haven't fallen asleep or abandoned, are there any questions that any of you have that I could answer for you? Or comments or suggestions?
Don't forget to unmute yourselves.
Yeah, back on the, how Wilson somehow convinced the American public to join the war effort, even though he did no preparatory work. What exactly did he say? I understand it, he said, we're, this is a different ideology we're fighting, but I mean, was that enough to convince a country to go to war?
Well, I think that's an interesting part. Now, of course, I didn't get into American propaganda and the role of newspapers and the way in which events like the Lusitania, among other ships that were sunk earlier in the war without warning with the loss of American life, got the Americans behind Wilson in doing this. But one of the things I wanted to point out is that there was opposition, unlike what we saw in World War II, where the one person who voted against going to war with Japan and Germany was doing that for ideological reasons, that felt that war was just never an answer to anything. In this particular case, the country was really not entirely unified, but once the declaration had been made, a natural tendency of any population is to support the government in something of this sort. And when that doesn't happen, as it happened in the United States during Vietnam, because of the way in which Lyndon Johnson failed to properly prepare the American people for that conflict, very quickly it became apparent to the administrations, that Johnson and then Nixon, that we don't have the American people behind us. There's a famous comment that Lyndon Johnson made, I believe it was Lyndon Johnson, not Nixon, when Walter Cronkite reported on the Tet Offensive. So it would have been Johnson, 68. And Cronkite said, basically, I don't see how we can win this conflict. Words to that effect. And Johnson alleged to have turned to one of his senior advisors and said, if we've lost Cronkite, we've lost the country. So the lack of preparation was key. Now, the nice part, if you want to call it that, for the Americans was that we'd already gotten pissed off at the Mexicans. We didn't trust them. We'd already fought with them, already gone into their country to try to hunt down Pancho Villa. We had established the identity of the Western Hemisphere being our province, and we weren't willing to walk off the international stage as a player and say, we're going to sit back and sit this one out. What I was trying to point out is that there was, if you look at it very carefully, from one perspective, we had nothing that really forced us into the war. That's different from what happened with Japan attacking Pearl Harbor and then Germany declaring war on us, when Roosevelt's kind of saying, oh crap, what just happened? Here, we declared war on Germany. Germany didn't declare war on us first. They just said, we're going to put unrestricted submarine warfare in, and we're going to encourage Mexico to invade the United States if the United States declares war on us. So the dynamics were a bit different, and the culture was a bit different, I guess, is another way to say it.
Thank you.
Anybody else, anything? Comments? Too much?
Oh, a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, all right, it's been my pleasure. I look forward to the next one. And I know that things will sometimes be confusing, but I certainly hope that it's been worth the effort.
Certainly.
We'll,
Oh,
we'll look forward to it too.
Michelle, thank you.
Well, thank you all.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right. Let's discuss this tomorrow. Can we do
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, sure. There was a question,
We've got to discuss it.
there was a
Sorry, go
question
ahead.
from Heather
Yeah.
about the recording being made available.
Yeah, well, I missed the first half of the second half of the lecture because I forgot to turn it back on again. But yes, I can share what we've got, which is incomplete, I'm sorry to say.
And if anyone has a copy of the first lecture, I would like that access.
Well, I've got a copy of the first lecture, but that's missing a hunk too, because we had some problem with that one.
Right.
And then this one, I just forgot right between, it's mostly the Russian aspect of this whole thing. And it's the time between the break ending and your return to the Western Front.
Okay.
So I'm sorry about that. It's terrible of me. I apologize.
Hers.
Who said that?
All right. Well, again, thanks everyone. I appreciate your interest. Barry, good to see you. And I look forward to seeing you all next week. And I hope it's been worth it.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye.
In their old.
Bye-bye.
Yeah. Okay,
Okay. I got to stop sharing my screen.
it's all right. I'll cut you all off in a minute.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay.